So the first thing that I want to do is I want to render this login component. So I'm going to say render login, and then I'm going to use screen to do screen.debug so I can get an idea of what the UI looks like right after I log in. And so the UI, we've got a form, we've got div, label for the username, and label for the password, and then a submit button. So now we want to select these different elements and interact with them in some way. So what I'm going to do is move over to my UI and I'm going to inspect this, and I'll take a look at the accessibility tab here, and then I'll select the input, and I'll see we've got a text box with the name of username, and that's how I can select that. And we can also take a look at the testing playground Chrome extension that I've got here, and we'll see that we've got a screen get by role text box username. So I'm going to copy that and we'll paste that right here, and then we'll do the same thing for our password. And what's interesting here is that this one is saying that we should use get by label text, and the reason that it's doing that rather than get by role is because passwords actually don't have an implicit role for security purposes, and so we can't use get by role for passwords like we do with our username input or other text boxes. And so we're going to do get by label text, and we'll copy this over here. And personally, I actually don't like the way that those two look side by side. And so we're actually going to switch this to get by label text username as well. And that does mean that we lose a little bit of confidence that this username is actually a text box. But once we start typing into it and asserting that our typing actually worked, then we get some of that confidence back. So I'm not quite as concerned about that. Great, then the last thing that we need is this submit button right here. And so we have a get by role button. That is perfect. So let's put that right there. And now we want to actually interact with this, and that's where user event comes in. So here I'm going to say, hey, username field, I want to type into that username field with some username. So we'll say Chuck Norris, and then we'll say type into the password field with I need no password, and then we'll click on that button. Great, so then we can do a screen debug right there and see what our UI looks like now once we've clicked this. Well, our UI is totally unchanged, and we're getting a ton of errors right here, and that's because we're trying to call onSubmit, but we never passed an onSubmit handler here. So let's go ahead and pass an onSubmit handler. onSubmit, and we'll have a function here, we'll call it handle submit. And then we can pass handle submit. And now, awesome, we have a passing test, and we'll get to that loading state in another exercise. So far, so good. Now we actually need to make some assertions. And the assertions that we want to make are specific to what this handle submit function is going to be called with. We want to make sure that it is indeed called, and that it's called with the data that we inputted into the username and password fields. So what I'm going to do is say submitted data as a variable, and then handle submit's going to get called with some data, and I'll just reassign submitted data to that data, and then I can assert that the submitted data equals username of Chuck Norris and password of I need no password. And there we go, everything is working super duper well. So let's go ahead and dive in, make sure that we can break this. So if I do a typo here for some reason, then that does fail. So we are testing what we think we're testing, and that means that this test is actually giving us some value. One other change that I want to make here is these two things are exactly the same, and I want to communicate through the way that I write my code that those things are intentionally the same, that they really should be the same. It's not just an accident. So I'm going to make a username variable here for Chuck Norris, and we'll do the same for the password. I need no password. And then down here, I'll just replace this with username, and I'll do the same for password. And thanks to object shorthand, we'll just get rid of that. And now I'm communicating that, hey, the thing that I typed into the username field is the thing that I'm going to get back in my submitted data when this onSubmit function is called. So it not only helps me avoid repeating myself here, but it actually also helps communicate some things that are important about the test. So let's go ahead and review. What we're doing here is we're rendering the login. We're finding some elements that are rendered by that login. We're typing into those elements, and we're clicking on that button that is rendered by the login. And then we also pass an onSubmit handler, which will take the data that it's called with and assign a local variable to that value so that we can then assert on that value after we've clicked that submit button.